you, everyone. Welcome to this event put on by the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law, the Transnational Economic Law and Dispute Settlement Group at the Chinese University of Hong Kong Faculty of Law. My name is Bryan Mercurio. I'm a professor at the faculty and also chair of the group. I'm delighted today to welcome you to this seminar on sovereign wealth funds. Since the beginning, really, of the global financial crisis, state-controlled entities, which include state-owned enterprises, sovereign wealth funds, other forms of governmental controlled institutions, have all become really prominent actors in transnational financial flows. Initially, those state-controlled entities played a significant role in mitigating the consequences of the credit crunch to Western financial institutions during the global financial crisis. Since then, their presence has grown significantly. Concurrently, they have, especially sovereign wealth funds, have changed their investment strategy, shifting towards a more active role in the management of their investments and expanding the sectors of their investments, which now include not only passive and conservative investment instruments, but also foreign direct investment in infrastructure, energy, and consumer goods. More importantly, these state-controlled entities are increasingly investing in the digital economy and gaining control over companies that operate in key sectors and critical sectors such as telecommunications, data management, and also artificial intelligence. State involvement in the economy has always generated debate between the supporters of the public, the state-owned and state-controlled model, and the private one. This struggle is not only ideological, but also has practical economic, political, geopolitical, and legal implications. The economic prominence of state-controlled entities since the beginning of the century, really, together with the launch of global initiatives by the Chinese government, which support a global role for Chinese entities along the Belt and Road and the Made in China 2025 initiative, to just name a few, have increased the number of Chinese-led acquisitions in Western markets, and that has triggered political reactions and regulatory responses. With this really in the foreground, the US, Australia, other countries have improved the operations of their own investment screening procedures, or really tightened, I should say. And more recently, even the European Union established its own investment screening mechanism, in addition to the ones that already exist at the member state level. All of these regimes consider with particular attention investments by state-controlled entities in the digital economy in order to protect innovative sectors that might have unpredictable consequences on the future of their domestic economies, on national security, and on the hegemonic role of the three main superpowers. In his new book, The Hunt for Unicorns, How Sovereign Wealth Funds Are Reshaping Investment in the Digital Economy, Mr. Winston Ma explores the role of sovereign wealth funds and sheds light on the operations and governance, focusing on their investments in the digital economy. Sovereign wealth funds investments in the high-tech sector and their participation in the fourth industrial revolution has undoubtedly exacerbated global tensions in tech competition and in the AI race. I'm honored, interested, and delighted to hear him speak tonight and this morning for those of you in North America, and the afternoon for those of you in the middle. I'll now introduce the speakers and give the floor to Mr. Ma for his presentation. Before I do, let me remind the participants here that you are muted, but we encourage questions throughout the event. Just use the chat function and I will collate the questions and ask them at the appropriate time. If your name is not listed in your Zoom sign-in, then please try to remember to include your name and maybe your affiliation along with that. So I'll introduce the main speaker and the two commentators, and then I will turn it over for the main event. So Mr. Winston Ma is an investor, attorney, author, and adjunct professor in the global digital economy at New York University. He's one of a small number of native Chinese who've worked in investment as an investment professional practicing capital market law in both the United States and China. Most notably, perhaps, he was managing director and head of North America office for the China Investment Corporation, CIC, China's sovereign wealth fund, for more than 10 years. He also worked at Barclays Capital as vice president at JP Morgan and as a corporate lawyer at Davis Polk and Wardwell. Along with the book, The Hunt for Unicorns, he's published a number of other books, and I'll just highlight one because it's a recent publication as well, The Digital War, How China's Tech Powers Shape the Future of AI, Blockchain, and Cyberspace. So I encourage you to also look at that book. We have two discussants today. The first discussant is Dr. Dini Sejko, a research associate at the Center for Comparative and Transnational Law, and also a research affiliate at the Fletcher Network for Sovereign Wealth and Global Capital at Tufts University. Dr. Sejko is a PhD graduate of the Chinese University, in fact, my student, so I'm delighted to see him furthering his career. And the second discussant is Professor Robert Howse, who is the Lloyd C. Nelson Professor of International Law at the NYU School of Law. His teaching and research focuses on international economic law and legal and political philosophy. I think most of you should know, do know or should know that he is one of the leading scholars and leading voices in the field of trade law. And I would just say very notably in the past, even more so, I guess, than decade or so ago, maybe 2 decades now, in the intersection between trade and environment and sustainable development. So I think that is enough for me, and I will now turn it over to Mr. Ma, who will speak for around 25 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I will try to keep my opening presentation below 25 minutes so I can have a very interactive discussion among the discussants and the audience together. So let me share the screen here. It's all good, Bryan? There's a screen? Yeah. So just to put today's discussion in context, you know, the concept of unicorn means private, unlisted tech startups that has a valuation of $1 billion. So it means a large enough tech startup, but it is still, you know, on the way up. And now the connection with the sovereign funds is that the sovereign investment funds with billions and actually trillions of government funding are putting money into this group out of strategic considerations, out of investment considerations, out of other considerations. And as a result, you know, the sovereign funds are changing the game of VC, you know, which used to be dominated by the traditional venture capital funds in Silicon Valley, in China, elsewhere. So that's the context of today's discussion. I'm very honored to be invited to CUHK because for my career path, right, it was all about global connectivity. You know, as Bryan introduced, you know, my last 2 decades was almost mostly at China-US cross-border. You know, I was educated both in China and the US. I practiced law in both China and New York. And then before I worked for CIC, China's sovereign wealth fund, I got the Wall Street training in New York, right, from JP Morgan and Barcap. Now today, you know, the Hong Kong has another context for the connectivity. You know, in the middle of China-US tension, you know, the Hong Kong capital market may actually play a very important role to connect the two superpower markets. Now let's get into this today's topic. You know, first of all, what is a sovereign fund? You know, we can think of 3 groups: the sovereign wealth funds, the government pension funds, and the central banks. You know, you may ask yourself this question: who holds the power in today's capital markets? You know, some would think about the investment banks like Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, right? Some would think about the large asset managers like a Blackstone, BlackRock, Fidelity, right? Some would think about high-flying hedge funds like Bridgewater, Skybridge Capital of Anthony Scaramucci, so on and so forth, right? But I would argue actually the sovereign funds are the powerhouse of the capital markets because they collectively have more than $30 trillion of assets under management. In fact, their assets, right, their capital provides the source for the Wall Street players, whether it's investment banks or asset managers or hedge funds. And today, you know, if we just look at one example, Norway's sovereign wealth fund, it has more than $1 trillion under management, and it has, in average, you know, more than 1.5% of every listed company in the world. And with more financial crisis globally, you know, these players are becoming more and more upfront. So here's a list of the largest sovereign wealth funds. Now it's interesting, you know, China has 3 sovereign funds out of these 3 categories. You know, the China Investment Corporation I used to work at there is a sovereign wealth fund, you know, because its mandate is to manage government wealth for China's future generations. And there's the Social Security Fund, which manages the Ministry of Finance money, and it provides the future pension payments, you know, for Chinese population. And then the third one is SAFE, you know, the investment arm of the central bank. Essentially, you know, it manages the liquidity of foreign reserve for the central bank. Also interesting here, right, that Hong Kong Monetary Authority, with more than $500 billion under management, is also within the top 10. Another observation here is you see many leading sovereign funds coming from the Middle East and Singapore. So altogether, sovereign wealth funds is very much a emerging market phenomenon, which is very interesting. Now the other side, for the pension funds, we see the North American, Europe players leading the charge here. Here, not too surprising, the U.S. Social Security Fund is the biggest one, and the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board is another U.S. pension fund. Some Canadian pension funds are also listed here, CPPIB, and some state pensions like CalPERS are also very well known in the market. And then you have Korea, so on and so forth, right? But the question you have maybe, you know, you would say we keep hearing about CIC or Singapore Temasek, right? But why we don't really hear about U.S. Social Security Fund in the capital markets? And the answer is the difference in investment strategy, because traditionally these sovereign funds, you know, even though they have hundreds of billions of assets, right, they tend to be very passive. You know, they're passive investors. They put money into the hands of external asset managers mostly. So here, if you look at this example, right, in the context of tech investing, traditionally, the sovereign investors will put money into venture fund, which is managed by external GP managers. And then the venture fund will invest into portfolio companies. In recent years, you know, more sovereign funds becoming active, and they try to become direct investors themselves. So they started by co-investing with external managers of the funds. So here on the right side, right, you see the sovereign funds investor put additional money into a partnership with the venture fund to co-invest in portfolio investment 3. You know, that's a way for the sovereign fund to start feeling about direct investing, which leads to their direct investments in recent years. Now, the starting point of this trend was most obvious in 2008, the previous financial crisis. During the 2008 crisis, lots of sovereign funds put money into the US Wall Street banks, which was struggling. So here you see for Citibank, for example, it received sovereign funds investments in 2008 crisis, both from Singapore funds like Temasek GIC, as well as the Middle East funds like the ADIA of UAE or KIA of Kuwait. And that was also the year that CIC was set up. I left Wall Street and I moved back to China to join CIC, right? And the very beginning, CIC put money into the U.S. Wall Street banks as well. Major investment in Morgan Stanley was about like $7 billion, and also had a $3 billion in Blackstone IPO. Just right at the beginning of the CIC. So that was a great time, to join the sovereign wealth funds, because first, it was a crisis time. So sovereign funds with billions of dollars means that you can pick your investments, right? And secondly, at that time, all the Western countries are in financial crisis, which means they seriously welcome investments from foreign sovereign funds like CIC. I got the chance to travel globally, got into really many interesting transactions without have to worry about investment regulations blocking those investments, right? Which is the new trend these days, which we will cover later in this presentation. Now, so we just talked about 2008, the first phase of sovereign funds becoming active direct investors. Now, the second phase of this trend is maybe, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, led by the Vision Fund. Now, what's interesting about the Vision Fund is its size. And that's very much due to the AUM size of the sovereign funds. Vision Fund is led by the famous Masayoshi-san of SoftBank, right? But if you look at the capital allocation, the source of capital, the source of the capital of the fund, most of the money, more than half of the fund money, come from 2 Middle East sovereign funds. One is Saudi Arabia's PIF, another is a UAE Mubadala fund. Altogether, they put together a $100 billion VC fund. Now, to put this into context, a typical VC fund in Silicon Valley is about $100 million. So that's like 1,000 times of the typical size of a VC fund. So of course, the Vision Fund is changing the game of the VC landscape, right? It puts billions of dollars into companies like Uber, Airbnb, so on and so forth. So they are not only hunting the unicorns, they are also creating the unicorns because they put large amount of capital into those companies. Another example is Ant Financial, the fintech arm of Alibaba. This is probably the best example of global sovereign funds creating a unicorn together. Right, for Ant Financial, its early investors included China's sovereign funds like CIC and the Social Security Fund, and then in more recent rounds, it attracted almost all the sovereign funds and global pension funds, like Singapore's Temasek GIC, like Malaysia Khazanah, Canadian Pensions CPPIB, and of course Vision Fund itself, right? So altogether, we can definitely say, these sovereign funds are creating more and more unicorns. But of course, this is just one side of the story. Another side of the story is, when you see global sovereign funds chasing tech startups, the countries where the tech startups are taking notice. Right, they try to protect their technology edge, and the most obvious one is the U.S. the US has a legal framework to review foreign acquisitions called the CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS. During the Trump administration, CFIUS was amended to cover more tech-driven transactions. The keyword here is TID, TID, because the new focus include three aspects. One is critical technology. The second is critical infrastructure, which means digital infrastructure as well as traditional infrastructure. And the third is about sensitive personal data. Altogether, you can see the coverage is very broad, from hard tech to invisible data. Here are a few examples, right? They're very well known. 2018, Alibaba tried to purchase MoneyGram, which is a mobile payment company in the US, and it was blocked due to the concern of data security of US users. Grindr, a more recent example. It's a gay dating app. Right? Obviously, it's not very obvious to think about the national security issue here, but hear me out. Actually, let me just convey what I heard. Yeah. So Grindr is a gay dating app. Chinese capital bought it, and 2 years later, CFIUS took another look, said actually there's a national security issue here, so the deal must be unwound. Okay, so it's actually, Grindr it got resold to a new group, apparently funded by non-Chinese capital. Now the point from the Washington DC is that because lots of gay guys are using the Grindr app, as such their location and their health data are visible through the app. So therefore, whoever holds the app can have very sensitive data of the user of the app, which may include US military people as well as government officials. So that was the national security analysis. And of course, the most recent one is TikTok, right? It's a China's short video app, started in China and it got very popular in the US through an acquisition, Musical.ly. Again, just like Grindr, the transaction was completed years ago, and then more recently, CFIUS took another look. They say, okay, there's a national security issue here, very sensitive data, this deal should be unwound. Yeah, and of course, under a Trump executive order, TikTok needs to be sold to a US-led consortium. Now, with the transition to Biden, the executive order is still effective, actually. So we'll still have to see what will happen to TikTok. Yeah, but the punchline here is traditionally national security review of foreign acquisition was mostly related to military-related sectors. Now there's more focus on technology and data-related sectors. Now, here is the third phase of sovereign funds become direct investors, right? Earlier we talked about they started with direct investing into the financial sectors, and secondly, recently they got into the tech sectors as powerful investors, and now the third phase, very recent, is that the sovereign funds are being used as a policy tool to promote R&D in technology sectors. One very obvious example is in China. Aside from CIC, China set up a dedicated sovereign wealth funds for the semiconductor sectors, where China has to import hundreds of millions of chips from the US every year. Okay, so in order to be more self-reliant, China set up a national semiconductor fund. About, its size is about $30 billion, which put a huge amount of money into the R&D of semiconductor technologies. Now with this, we have a great example. SMIC. Actually, it's listed in Hong Kong, so there's a very profound connection with Hong Kong and Hong Kong's positioning in the middle of China-U.S. tech war. So SMIC is Shanghai-based semiconductor company. It means Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, SMIC. Now it was delisted NYSE 2009 by the company, probably because the company expects to receive China sovereign fund money, okay? Because soon after its delisting, the company received billions of investments from China's sovereign fund, the dedicated semiconductor sovereign fund. And then within months, it got relisted at the Shanghai's Stock Board, like the Shanghai's NASDAQ board, and its valuation went to all-time high, right? So far, so good. But of course, the U.S. took notice, right? Because the funding was revealed on the day that the U.S. announced new restrictions on Huawei technologies. It was viewed, the SMIC was viewed by the U.S. as an alternative supplier to Huawei, right? If you recall, U.S. sanctioned Huawei so that Huawei cannot get access to global supply of semiconductor components. Yeah. Further on SMIC, September 2020, U.S. Commerce put the company on the sanction list. So SMIC could not get the global supply of semiconductor technologies as well. Furthermore, December 2020, U.S. Department added the company to a blacklist, a list of companies that are deemed to have military ties. Now the impact is more serious this time because the stock ban list means no U.S. money can invest in the company, which means for U.S. sovereign funds like the U.S. government pensions, as well as the U.S. asset managers, they can no longer trade the stock once the order is effective. Okay, and actually, in January 2021, the MSIC and other indexes has already removed SMIC from the list, from their index. Okay, from the index. Now, fast forwarding to today, after the transition into Biden administration, there was lots of talk about maybe the stock ban will be lifted, right? And some companies tried to push back, and Xiaomi even successfully got itself removed from the list 2 weeks ago, through a legal battle in the U.S. ironically. But the latest is yesterday, Biden administration re-announced the list, actually expanded the list to 59 names and their subsidiaries. SMC remains on the list. Yeah, so the stock ban is firmly in place. There's no more doubt whether Trump's executive order would be implemented or not, right? Because now you have a completely new executive order, make it more clear and less room for legal challenge in the U.S. court system. So in summary, the SMIC story will continue, and it is an example that the U.S. actions can actually have a serious impact because the stock price actually really took a hit since U.S. Taking actions on the company. So and this is just the U.S. Defensive side, right? Well, the offensive side is the U.S. is also copying what China is doing, setting up sovereign funds to promote technologies that the U.S. wants to develop. And here, the best example is 5G. 5G, right? As we all know, like China's Huawei is leading this game. So what the U.S. government is doing is coming up at least 3 sovereign wealth fund ideas to compete with Huawei on this. One is a new law to set up a 5G tech R&D fund, like a few billions, to promote research of 5G technologies that can be an alternative to Huawei technology. And another wild idea is to set up a European 5G company holding fund, namely to acquire a controlling stake in the leading European 5G companies, such as Nokia and Ericsson. Now, the biggest one is the Development Finance Corporation. At the last year of the Trump administration, Trump restructured a DC entity called International Development Finance Corporation, DFC. It has $60 billion, and it is putting a portion of its money into 5G as well as even 6G technology research. So it's a very interesting phenomenon that both China and US are using the sovereign funds specifically to promote digital technology research and development. So to close the presentation, I certainly hope the China-US tech war will stop, but the reality is it may just be a new beginning, since Biden replaced Trump. Very quick examples here. 2 months ago, Biden administration came up with executive order to develop domestic production of semiconductors. As we see, right, Taiwan TSMC and South Korea Samsung, the two leading semiconductor chip factories, are planning to set up major sites in the US as a result of this. And on the China side, in the March government report, China announced a 7% year-on-year increase of R&D spending for the next 5 years, from 2025, in pursuit of major breakthroughs in technology, right? So you can only imagine that the digital war just have a new starting point with the new leadership, Biden in the US, and China will continue the tech competition with the US. And for that, the sovereign funds will play a very important role. So in order to get to the whole story, read my 2 books. One is about the hunt for unicorns. Sovereign funds become the new venture capitalists, and the other one is the digital war, where the sovereign funds actually become the policy tools to promote technology research and investments. So the story will go on, and I turn back to Bryan.
Great, thank you very much, Winston. That there's a lot to think about in what you said. I know I have a few questions myself, but I will hold off, and we will turn and let our 2 commentators begin to unpack what you said and to perhaps take it further and share their views. So we'll turn it first to you, Dini, for about 10 minutes.
Yeah, we'll see about that, maybe even less. But thank you, Winston, for your very interesting presentation and even more interesting book. I've read this one and reading the other one currently, so they are both very interesting. And I'd like with you to look at some issues that you touch upon on the book, and Bryan mentioned them at the beginning, but we didn't focus so much in the presentation, and they regard the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the prominent initiative of the Chinese government. It's even part of the Chinese constitutions now. So that's quite relevant. And the very launch of the Belt and Road Initiative was transformative also for the main Chinese sovereign wealth funds. CIC and SAFE at the time dedicated some portion of their assets to establish the new Silk Road Fund, which is a dedicated fund for Silk Road for projects implemented along the Belt and Road Initiative. And at the same time, the Silk Road Fund aims to pursue the objectives of the Belt and Road. But we all know that the Belt and Road initiative was not launched alone. It was launched together with a very significant policy for technological development of Chinese companies, which is Made in China 2025. So together, these two initiatives raised many eyebrows in the United States, and you mentioned the strengthening of CFIUS and the increase of the scope of the analysis and assessment of the risk of foreign investment coming from SOEs and SWFs. And on the other hand, Europe, which for most of the time has been quite open towards foreign direct investment, supporting multilateral global initiatives for the governance of SWF, such as the Santiago principles, with an increase of Chinese investments in the European Union, especially after the acquisition of a major infrastructure in Greece, the acquisition of the port of Piraeus started to change its approach and launch an initiative for the creation of an European level investment screening mechanism, in addition to the existing rules in some member states for the screening of investments. And I also need to emphasize that already member states at the time had strengthened their investment screening mechanism. So to sum up and clarify the first question, because when the EU regulation on investment screening mechanism came out, or started to be effective, your book was already published. So you were not able to fully include this dimension into the book, but you as an experienced lawyer and investor, you are very well aware of this dynamic. So this is what I want to ask. In your understanding, how the EU investment screening mechanism operates compared to CFIUS? Are these two screening mechanisms quite similar, or they are distinct? And do you think the objective of the European Union is to create a similar mechanism such as the US? And another sub question regarding the screening mechanisms: which is the role of screening mechanisms as hegemonic tools? So we mentioned that sovereign wealth funds have a propositive role in pursuing the strategies of the government, so of the Chinese government, but also of the US government now. But on the other hand, the screening mechanisms can be used as hegemonic tools to prevent the success of certain foreign companies in certain sectors. So do you think they are effective so far? This is the first issue that I wanted to discuss. The second issue that it's also clear in the book, but I want to emphasize for our discussion, regards the activities of sovereign wealth funds. So you also mentioned that many of these funds are operating together. Sometimes they engage with third parties, such as is the case of the Vision Fund. But in other cases, they just co-invest with each other. And right. While co-invest, which are the benefits and driver of co-investment? Why the funds choose to engage in co-investments? And do you think this is beneficial for the economic objectives of the funds, or there are other reasons that determine this strategy, this investment strategy? Thank you.
Sure. No, that's great questions. You know, I start with the co-investing and then I touch on the European policy thing, you know, which can be an interesting transition into Rob, right? As he deals with WTO and the global trade. No, I think for co-investing, the trend of co-investing, more sovereign funds working on investments together I think one simple reason is that tech investing is difficult. It's not easy to be a venture capitalist yourself. Like in the past, right, the sovereign funds, government pension funds, they put money into the external VC fund managers, and they just take a passive role. Now, if you want to be a venture capitalist, that means you have to develop a very big internal team, and you probably need to set up your overseas offices near the innovation hubs, whether it's Silicon Valley, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's Southeast Asia, so on and so forth. Of course, a few sovereign funds can do that. Let's say GIC Temasek, they have overseas offices everywhere because they have done that for 3 decades. Or the more aggressive pensions like CPPIB, they have offices globally, right? However, when you look at more traditional pension funds, or sovereign funds, which are still subject to very strict governance requirements, let's say the U.S. pensions, most obviously, like CalPERS. The CalPERS just don't have that many overseas offices, and they just don't have that many internal teams. And on top of that, they cannot really pay the people market compensation to entice successful venture capitalists to work in-house. Okay, so it is very difficult for all the sovereign funds and the pension funds to become venture capitalists themselves. So as such, co-investing is a good way to leverage the resource of other sovereign wealth funds. Yeah, so back to my presentation, Ant Financial may be a good example. It's a China-based unicorn, right? And the China's sovereign funds already invested. So for later coming sovereign funds from Singapore, Canada, Middle East, they can rely on China sovereign funds due diligence, their judgment, right? And for operations, for the company's operations, they can also rely on CIC, so China's Social Security Fund, to understand what's the upcoming regulations and what's the impact for this fintech unicorn. So to your point about co-investing, I think it's just a natural process for sovereign funds to become venture capitalists. When they become bigger and more mature, they can do more direct deals themselves. Now, to your European point, I think it's really interesting to look at Europe's position in the context of both China, US are increasing their investment review regulations. And to your point, right? In the past, the Europe, UK are much more open to foreign acquisitions. So lots of time, China Capital would say, if CFIUS blocks China's capital, this will only hurt the US industries because the UK, Europe are more open and China Capital will go there, okay? That was the argument a few years ago. But now, I guess for the European government officials, they're asking the question, like in the context of China, US becoming the net buyers, is it wise for the Europe to be the net seller amid a tech competition among the 3 innovation hubs, right? And I think more increasingly, the EU government officials are saying that was not wise. We should have our own investment review regulations as well. So in that kind of context, the EU new regulations are very similar to the US CFIUS. And it's certainly very similar in the sense it pays special attention to China capital. Yeah, because China is a huge innovation center itself. And if China buys more technology, it will help China become stronger and stronger. And that's not a good thing for EU to compete with China. So I would say the regulation thinking very similar. And if anything, if something different I can think of, I may say, EU puts even more emphasis on sensitive personal data. So for businesses that involves a personal data play, maybe EU will take even a more harsh approach, in terms of regulating foreign acquisitions. Yeah. So maybe I stop here and turn to Rob.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Winston. So Rob, over to you.
Thanks very much for this invitation to discuss a most significant and interesting range of issues. First of all, since the virtual location of our meeting today is Hong Kong, I wanted to take a moment to express my solidarity to the people of Hong Kong in defending their freedom and retaking their democracy. I note with concern the arrest today of attorney and democracy activist Chow Hang-tung, and I hope for her rapid release from custody. So it's a great pleasure to again connect with my colleague and co-instructor, Winston Ma. These are wonderful books. They reflect the work of a mind who sees the big picture, many different levels and connections, from politics to technology, to law and finance. And in co-teaching on sovereign finance with Winston, I've had the benefit of these insights over the last few years, even outside the access to his wonderful books. And so I strongly recommend the books, whatever discipline or professional orientation you're coming from. If you want to understand a lot about the world as it's evolving, these books are an essential place to go. So I'm going to, as has already been intimated, I think by by Bryan and Winston, give a bit of a WTO perspective on some of these issues. First of all, the WTO is in a sense way behind, and as I listen to Winston in class and read his work, it just strikes me, how the decades long rounds of consensus building negotiations that have been the hallmark of the GATT and the WTO are almost designed to bypass the change, the rapid change of the contemporary world, and so it's very unlikely that the WTO has much possibility institutionally, because it's worked primarily on the basis of these very lengthy rules negotiations and then dispute settlement on rules that itself, to the extent that it's still working, and now it's somewhat dysfunctional without an appellate body, it takes several years. And so the real-time management of these issues and the genuine, concerns and conflicts across borders that different perspectives raise, different national perspectives and interests, this cannot be done through an institution like the WTO as it's traditionally operated. And so then the question becomes, are we going to fall back on unilateralism, or can we imagine new fora of cooperation? Of course, we have to admit, and this is very clear, that there are genuinely different perspectives and interests. So cooperation does not mean consensus, but it may mean a process where the path is not determined so unilaterally, but with better information and understanding of the interests and values of other parties. And so I'm not sure that we have exactly that kind of institution. Maybe greatly expanding the OECD or changing radically UNCTAD might give us that. But it's worth thinking about where we could do this kind of dialogue or effort at cooperation or coordination, because at least the way the WTO has been structured and historically operated, it just is not able to, to perform, that kind of function, which is not in any way to denigrate the importance of the traditional role of the WTO in policing border measures like tariffs. And we saw with the pandemic and so on, that role is still very relevant and important to, to many challenges of international, cooperation. Another point, and this struck me when I read the communique of the recent G7 trade ministers summit on WTO reform, is the disconnect between what one would call, or indeed what a USTR ambassador Tai, I think, called the traditional trade world, and what's going on in policy. So you have an agenda of WTO reform to rein in more subsidies and rein in state enterprises, but and Winston usefully in one slide showed what the U.S. is doing in terms of public investment. So you have the EU and the US saying we need new WTO rules to constrain this, but these are big policy initiatives, and in fact the question would be whether some of them wouldn't actually run afoul of actual WTO rules. And in a way, I've observed this disconnect. I use sometimes when I would go to Washington, folks would tell me there's no such thing as a state enterprise in the United States. There's a kind of, disconnect. They don't think that CalPERS or NASA are state enterprises. And I think this disconnect is still there, and it pervades, a certain attitude in the world that advises, trade ministers. And I can't really imagine that the WTO would start to hit on state enterprises when a much larger group of countries are now reactivating them with new kinds of roles that Winston has, I think, really usefully touched on.
I think the reactivate is really interesting point, Rob. Let's talk about the chip industry, right? My undergrad major, before I become a happy lawyer, banker, investor, my undergrad was semiconductor physics, electronic materials major. So if you look at the origin of Silicon Valley, right? Let's say the Intel, those guys, they started with government contracts from the U.S. So some of the initial leadership figures at the Intel were former CIA guys. These are just public information. China is very similar these days, and now it's just interesting that EU, may have to look into that direction in order to compete with China and the U.S.
Yes, and in fact, many of these trade guys, they don't know where the internet started, right? The DARPA and so on. They think it was started by maybe Bill Gates, So there's a real knowledge, a disconnect. And if you try and talk in Geneva in the WTO world, about things like blockchain and digital currencies, the knowledge gap is even greater, and they know it to some extent. To the credit of the new leadership in the WTO, they're now organizing seminars to teach trade officials what blockchain is and so on. But there are real knowledge disconnects that I think are kind of skewing the agenda and making it a little anachronistic and not so relevant. So all this emphasizes the need to think about other processes and means of cooperation and coordination in respect of the digital economy. And on crypto or digital currencies, again, it seems to me that what we are going to witness, if we're not witnessing already, and I love Winston's reaction to this, is intensifying competition between governments and private issuers, miners, and that's something that's going to be fun to try and understand and theorize, and how it affects the way that transactions are done, and that may
so
impact.
very quickly on this, Rob.
Yeah.
I think you touched on blockchain, cryptocurrency, sovereign digital currency. Very quickly, I would just say, that's the new frontier of the China-U.S. tech competition, right? Because China is the first major economy to launch mass-scale testing of the sovereign digital currency. So U.S. is a little behind, right? But last month, U.S. Federal Reserve has announced the plan to accelerate the research and potentially the launch of a U.S. digital currency. And I noted that Powell said that U.S. will try to be the leadership in central bank digital currency globally, right? So,
every time one of these statements is made, right, the shares of these companies, change one way or the other. It's kind of fun to see how sensitive the market is. But I see it as definitely something that is not stoppable. I mean, the narrative that all of a sudden, some government or state is going to basically crush, crypto. I think it's a completely implausible narrative, and this relates also to my final observation. And I'd be interested in whether Winston thinks this is right or not. You talked about CFIUS and the reforms and so on, and of course a part of that is signaling. Is the U.S. signaling we're really going to want to be much more autonomous and much more cautious about foreign capital, foreign transactions, or is this really just a tightening of an existing regime where in fact it's almost become more evident where the red flags are going to be? And I see an unusual degree of optimism. Originally, a lot of intrepidation about how this would be applied, what the regs meant. But now talking to folks in the CFIUS bar, I think my sense is that there isn't any feeling of doom, and that there's still a lot of interest in the U.S., a lot of interest in transactions, and even also where sanctions are disrupting certain transactions and the financing options of certain companies, that there's a lot of money to be made, and in most cases we're going to find a way of doing it through relationships of one sort or another across
I think
borders.
that money matters. Money matters, right? And the money talks. So let me quickly comment on this, and then maybe Bryan and Dini can put some final thoughts on that. I think that the punchline is the money is still flowing. What's really interesting is last 12 months, right, including year to date, despite all the trade war, digital war, everything war between China and US, it has been a record year for Chinese companies going IPO in the US. It's just tremendous, right? Because the capital market's still ongoing, and the transactions are still talking, right? I mean the M&A market, and the M&A market. So overall, right? The market is more resilient and more deeply connected than people thought. So I think the capital flow will keep the dialogue of the two superpower economies going, and hopefully we'll find a new equilibrium soon. And in the middle, like Hong Kong has become this kind of a transition place. Some Chinese companies are asked to be delisted from New York Stock Exchange. So instead they move to Hong Kong, right? They're listing in Hong Kong, and now for some of the companies that are still listed in the US, they are contemplating or already did the Hong Kong listing just in case, right? So I think, you know, the market is just resilient enough to be able to absorb all these unexpected shocks. Bryan, Dini? Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Rob and Dini, for those comments, and Winston for responding. You know, I'll just mention a few things. I mean, one, I'll just pick up on something Rob said. Maybe be careful what you wish for. I mean, as you know, the US, EU, Japan have an effort to try to really restructure the whole rules on subsidies. And if, you know, if in fact it is true that that the US and others to an extent are recapitalizing sovereign wealth funds for really domestic purposes, you know, maybe they will end up getting caught. Another point, you know, Rob, which is off subject, so I'll only mention it very briefly. I mean, we spend hours and days and weeks and years, you know, trying to fiddle with the rules to say promote, you know, sustainable development, or will an environmental measure be consistent with WTO law? And if we just look back at Winston's numbers of $30 trillion in the sovereign wealth fund, can you imagine if the sovereign wealth funds decided collectively not to invest in fossil fuel, not to invest in you know, in tobacco? The amount that change would happen overnight. You know, we struggle, but as Winston said, money talks, right? I have two questions, and then I'll get to some of the questions from the floor. I'm going to use my moderator prerogative here. The first is really this, I think, U.S. you know, fascination, I guess, with national security and CFIUS, and we can, you know, date this to the early 80s really with Japan, and you're right, in any kind of technology sector, which well, didn't have military use but was technology related. And further now down to China. And so this notion of even saying it's national security, say, to not sell, you know, not allow the sale to Grindr, to unwind it. I mean, why not just simply be intellectual honest here? Actually, like Canada and Australia and others, I mean, Canada's most famous blocking of a deal was the space arm in space to a US company. Right, it wasn't national security grounds, and Australia blocks many things on a national interest, public interest view. Do you think that that's where the US is going to move, away from really trying to justify everything in a national security setting and just say, actually, it's not in our national interest? Let me ask the second question as well, and then I'll turn it to you for comments there.
Yeah.
The second one relates to semiconductors and chip making. We clearly are seeing a bifurcation there. I just read today China imported $350 billion in dollars in chips in 2020.
Yes.
And now, of course, as you mentioned, there's the sanctions against SMIC and others, and this real drive for local production. And it's a drive for local production, of course, not so much actually to compete on the world stage initially, but to ensure that China can still operate in the near and middle term, given tensions with the US. And you know, it seems that $170 billion of subsidies have already been given to these companies, and now you have the sovereign wealth fund pouring money in. Does this kind of bring back the worry that sovereign wealth funds are not investing for profit and for business purposes, but investing as domestic entities, champions of domestic entities? And will that, and this kind of dovetails into a question that an audience member had, will that resurrect the notion that came up maybe 10 or 15 years ago, that we should somehow restrict investments of sovereign wealth fund, we should limit the amount they can invest in, we should limit their voting, shareholding, etc.?
You know, but both excellent questions. You know, but both can, you know, lead to like a really lengthy law review articles.
You have 20 seconds. No, I'm just joking.
Exactly. First, you know, I love your comparison between Canada and the US, because, you know, I actually lived in Toronto for 4 years, you know, for CIC's North America office. As I got to know Canadians better than average people. So actually, I like their approach. You know, in a nutshell, you know, call a spade a spade. All right. So the Canadian test for foreign investment is as direct as a net benefit test, right? It's say, is this beneficial to Canada? You know, and of course, you know, Rob was, you know, originally from Canada, spent time at law school in Canada, so I let Bob add more to that Canadian point. But to your point, to your second question, you know, I think that's really the $1 trillion question right now. Is like for sovereign funds, should it be pure financial investor, or it can also carry on policy motives, right? Now, what's interesting is not only CIC, but also global sovereign funds are increasingly saying they have multiple objectives, including the Western sovereign funds, like the Irish fund. You know,
the Irish fund also.
Exactly, that's Canada, right?
Yeah.
Now the Irish guy, you know, the Irish fund during the 2008 crisis, they put money into the finance sector, save the banks, so they become like large shareholders of the banks, and you know, and it's hard to, you know, it's obviously both for financial investment and for financial stability, right? So you have multiple objectives already, but now they come up with a new term called the double bottom lines, which means when they evaluate an investment project, they would not only look into the direct financial returns, but also the positive social implications. So, for example, you know, promoting the domestic economic development, creating jobs in Ireland, so on and so forth, right? So maybe you say, oh, you know, this is just for domestic, right? But you know, if the Irish fund, or let's say another sovereign fund that is more active in the global market, instead of just looking at the domestic, right? Then it becomes a much more complex question, right? You know, maybe they will just bid for foreign tech companies in the hope they can bring the technology back to the home market, right? And that fund can outbid everyone, you know, with huge bidding price, and you could argue that, you know, this actually changed the free market dynamics. So this is really the main issue here. Rob, please.
I couldn't agree more.
All right. Yeah, and you know, I mean, a few countries over the past few years have, of course, added a bit of a, you know, enhanced screening process when it's a sovereign wealth fund to ensure again that the investment is in the national interest. I'll throw a couple of more questions at you that we had from the audience. One, just to summarize it, I guess, is to what extent do you believe this will become an issue in the next few years as part of the US-China increasing conflict, whatever you want to call it, hegemonic battle, whatever. And another question I will put to you is, will there be a tension between sovereign wealth funds and central banks? Will this lead to a tension between sovereign wealth funds and central banks?
Oh, very, very interesting. So for the first one, you know, I do think, you know, we will see more examples of SMIC going forward. You know, it's a very interesting example that a company, right, that received, you know, China's sovereign fund investment on one hand, got a big boost, but at the same time, subject to the US sanction regulations, where US asset managers can no longer invest in the company. So right, it's a great example that, you know, put it bluntly, that people have to pick sides. You have to pick your sides. You know, for SMIC, it delisted from New York Stock Exchange relisted in Shanghai, and good they have Hong Kong like the neutral place, right? Which still allowed some of the U.S. investors to put money in. And from a industry operation perspective, right, it gets the domestic supply chain support, but because of the U.S. sanction, the company is cut off from the global supply of components and the new technologies, right? So in other words, the decoupling is really happening and accelerating. So I would imagine more examples of that will happen, and we will see more sovereign funds will be used as policy tools for technology research and investments. Definitely in the US and China, and even in EU, right? Where lots of countries promote free market, and it's very hard to get a consensus among 20 plus countries, but still, right? The EU already socialized the idea to set up a 100 billion sovereign funds to promote European technology developments, quote unquote, to have our own tech champions. So overall, I think we will see more sovereign funds to come up that way, and we will see more tensions out of these sovereign funds. So that's to your question.
Sure,
Yeah.
thanks. Actually, Rob, I think I'm going to direct the next question to you.
Sure.
And it's actually in response to my perhaps flippant comment about sovereign wealth funds could have power and power for good by shifting, by not investing in say fossil fuels. And being moderator, I have the privilege of turning the hot seat to you instead of answering it myself. And the question essentially says, so if there was a move, if some sort of sovereign wealth fund action could prompt a move, say, to electric cars, isn't there a risk that this could have a serious social impact, e.g., poorer populations could not afford to switch to electronic vehicles? Would there be checks and balances, or what checks and balances could be put into place to prevent social disruption?
Well, first of all, it's happening. If you look at Norway's fund, which ironically is bankrolled by fossil fuel revenues, they've gone quite a distance to developing a sustainability approach to their holdings. CalPERS also is moving in that kind of direction, as far as I understand it, and Winston can correct me if I'm off base. So, and in fact, in our seminar, in our seminar, right, last fall, Winston, we had an excellent session on ESG investing and sovereign funds. But to go to the specific question, because one should always give a specific answer to a specific question, I think that obviously, the way in which, capital affects the world results in social disruptions of many kinds. And so I'm not sure that I understand that this particular one would be that, that different from others in terms of the affordability of EVs. This is where I think it's going to be interesting to see how China operates in competition with the US. And already you have players like NIO, which are kind of competing with Tesla. But also, what Winston, what is the EV manufacturer that's trying to produce a vehicle at a much more modest cost in China that's had some success? And I think they actually have been listed, or at one point were listed on NASDAQ.
Yeah. Xiaopeng, and also there's another guy coming from from a former Alibaba guy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the nature of the technology is such that there's a positive story here. I think competition will bring the prices of EV vehicles down, and the mystique that Musk has put around Tesla, that it's somehow some kind of enormously exotic technology that to which he or a few others have the secret formula. We're discovering soon that that's not the case, and the question will be the extent to which the U.S. allows competing EVs in these lower price ranges, to be full access to the U.S. market, which relates to regulatory barriers as well at the state level.
Sure. And Bryan, I just recall you earlier you had a second question about central bank versus sovereign funds, right? Now I think it's a really interesting question, because I lived through it. CIC was created 2008, right? And then China had the SAFE, the central bank's investment arm for a long time. But just like many other central banks, SAFE, China's SAFE was mostly a fixed income investor at that time. Most of the SAFE investments were in the U.S. Treasuries. This is obviously another angle of geopolitical, let's say, friendship, if you will, which also a proof that money relationship can give us like a more kind of constructive dialogue. So, right, because the U.S. the SAFE is like the 1 trillion plus U.S. Treasury holders, right, and plus the Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac fixed income securities, so on and so forth. But overall, more fixed income, and the CIC was created, right, to find to develop a more diversified portfolio, get more into alternative investments, in the hope that it can better preserve the value and improve the value, increase the value of the foreign reserve of the country, right? So I think for many countries, to your question, may follow China's example, to create multiple sovereign funds. They may have like a one sovereign fund. They may have the central bank to focus on the liquidity of the foreign reserve, and just to put the foreign reserve into more liquid investments, and then for different sovereign fund vehicles, they can invest in more diversified portfolio, more alternative investments, potentially more risk reward profile. Yeah,
on that last point, I think since we're talking now even about the macro environment, I mean, we have out there the inflation warriors, but my sense is it's going to be a long time before we see the return of bonds, and the fact is that to make money in an environment of extremely low, in some cases real negative interest rates, requires active, if not aggressive, investing management, and so that's the world we live in, unless unless the inflation warriors are right and we go back to double-digit inflation or something. The money to be made is in actively managed equity.
Yeah, we see this in the younger sovereign countries, younger sovereign funds, especially in Africa, actually, Bryan. For example, like in Nigeria, one of the best example, but there's other countries as well. Their sovereign fund has like three prong. They have three prong. One is about managing the liquidity of the foreign reserve. That's one part of the money. Another part is like this wealth fund, right? It's a diversified portfolio to increase the wealth for future generations. And then the third is like a local infrastructure promotion. This has a bit of a government objective, local economic development objective. So it's a very interesting example. Like when you look at these three prong, you have liquidity investments, you have like wealth investments, and you also have like infrastructure investments, right? And that's a great example that more and more sovereign funds are set up to have multiple objectives.
I
And-
want to say something
go ahead,
in relation
Dini.
to our previous question on the activities of sovereign wealth funds as a force for good. So like in 2018, 6 of the sovereign wealth funds that are members of the International Forum for Sovereign Wealth Funds gathered together and established a new initiative, which is called One Planet. So, this initiative brings together 6 sovereign wealth funds, which are the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, the Kuwait Investment Authority, the New Zealand Sovereign Wealth Fund, and the Qatar Investment Authority, and the Norwegian one. I think I mentioned all of them. So in this structure, the funds agreed to pursue greener investments and to promote long-term value creation with sustainable objectives. So there is this drive, and also in addition to the 6 funds which are part of this One Planet initiative, there are also other funds that enlist within their internal rules the pursuit of sustainable investments as part of their investment strategy, and one of those is the Australian Future Fund.
Okay, we are over time, but there is one fascinating question, and so I want to ask it. And the question essentially, Winston, is how could a country control or counter, I'm going to just read the question, the very likely possibilities of certain sovereign funds using investment capabilities of aggressively pursuing its politics and influencing domestic politics of other countries? And then we're going to have to end with this question.
Yeah, you know, and the interesting example here, it's a very recent example. Actually, it's the U.S. Believe it or not, you know, the thing coming to my mind. And maybe Rob, you can talk about CIC or something, China thing. But let me talk about the U.S. thing. You know, here's the interesting development in Indonesia. You know, Indonesia starts with a new sovereign fund this year. You know, so they announced the beginning of this year that their new, you know, for their new sovereign wealth fund, they're going to put in like $5 billion or something. Okay, and now for a country like Indonesia, you know, like a 300 million population, a huge economy, right? This is not a big enough size of sovereign fund. So actually, U.S. DFC I mentioned in my presentation is reported to put $2 billion into the Indonesia sovereign fund. So it's not a co-investing. It's not a co-investing. It's actually putting money into the fund itself. You know, so it's like a U.S. giving is going to put $2 billion to be managed by the Indonesia sovereign fund, and also in the bucket would include the sovereign fund of UAE. You know, now obviously UAE wants to have more influence in the Islamic region, I guess. Yeah, and to me, this is a very interesting example that the sovereign funds of countries like the U.S., like the UAE, right? You know, they can and also like there's another example. India also sets up infrastructure fund. It also got money from several foreign sovereign funds like UAE, again UAE, as well as others. So when you look at these examples, right, sovereign funds can really play a diplomatic role, you know, in cross-border relationships. You know, when a small country sets up a sovereign fund and it's not enough money, you know, in the case of Indonesia, U.S., right, you know, can participate in that play and exercise more influence in the future development of that country. I think it's a very interesting example. Yeah.
And I would just, you know, add to that I have exactly the I think the reverse perspective from that of the questioner, which is I see, sovereign funds as a useful tool of foreign policy. And in particular, I've been encouraging, the Biden administration, to the extent it's increasing aid to Palestine, to work possibly in the context of the Abraham Accords with the UAE to create a real innovation fund for Palestine that would support, tech startups and a much higher level of tech know-how in the areas of occupation that could counter, to some extent, the current tech supremacy or superiority of the occupying power, and that's definitely a political objective. And I think sovereign finance could and should be used to support that objective of capacity building and technology and innovation in Palestine.
Yeah,
very interesting. Very controversial. Yes, Dini, go ahead.
Yeah, on this point that Winston was mentioning earlier, and the influence of other state-owned entities in sovereign wealth funds, what is an interesting example of collaborations within the Belt and Road Initiative is what has happened with the Turkish sovereign wealth fund, which has been established in the recent years. The Turkish fund has signed agreements with Chinese state banks in order to receive loans from these entities to finance its investment projects.
Oh, quite interesting. On that note, I think we should draw it to a close. We're quarter of an hour already over time. I would like to thank both Winston and Rob for taking time this morning, your time, to be with us and sharing your views. And also, of course, Dini this evening, and all of the participants from Hong Kong. We've spent a Friday evening with you, and participants wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. Do keep an eye out on the CUHK Faculty of Law and Center website for other upcoming events.